Hello, scholars. This is Tanya Wilcox, Program Director for TheDream.Us. Thank you for joining us today for this, where we hope to be very informative session to tell you a little bit about what's going on with DACA and what are some things that you could be doing to prepare yourself for what's coming. So thank you. We have two experts joining us today to hopefully give you some other information and answer your questions. And a little bit about the agenda. We are gonna talk a little bit about some of the possible Supreme Court decisions that might come down, a little bit about renewing your DACA, and then some options that you might be able to explore in regarding your immigration cases. What we won't be able to do today is necessarily answer questions that are very specific to your case. We are going to give you more of a general overview and also some of the things that you can be thinking about or in situations that might be happening in your life that would tell you that you should go seek immigration help. So while we will take questions and we will answer, they will be in a more general way. And then we will also share with you some resources so that you can find some legal expertise. And today we have two longtime immigration advocates and allies joining us today. Maria Blanco, who's the Executive Director at the UC Davis Law School and their Immigration Legal Services Center, and Marina Bell, who's a staff attorney with the New Haven Legal Association. And she has done webinars for us before, and she's helped other immigrants with their immigration issues. So thank you both for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maria. Go ahead, Maria.
Hi, good evening. I'm glad you could make it to this call today. With the Supreme Court argument on the DACA case being held tomorrow, we thought this would be a good time to go through some of the possible outcomes of the Supreme Court case. There's a lot of interest in that. And you know how with one thing we can't do is predict, but we have a general sense of the different possibilities that might come out of the case. So next slide. So let's, I've tried to organize this by the possible outcomes, and I will go quickly through the different possible outcomes, and then after I finish with those, I will take questions and answers about this, about the possible outcomes of the Supreme Court hearing. So the very first thing that could happen, one possible outcome, would be that the Supreme Court decides that it is not its role to even look at whether the end of DACA was legal, that this is not something for the courts, that the courts that already looked at this before had no business really reviewing the decision, and it would just, and that would be the decision, that it can't review the administration's decision to end DACA. If the court were to decide that, if they said we have no grounds for reviewing this decision by the administration, the effect of that would be that the rescission that the government made of DACA would go forward. And what we don't know is that what the administration will do with people who have currently have DACA, whether they'll let people keep it until it expires, or whether they will end it immediately once the court makes its decision. So that's the first possible outcome. Let me just say, before I go to the second possible outcome, that we don't know when we will have a decision by the Supreme Court. The whole Supreme Court term ends at the end of June. So we could get a decision in January, or we could get a decision in March, or we could get a decision at the end of June. We have no way to know that. There are a lot of us who have worked for a long time on these issues, And we know that the Supreme Court, when it faces a very difficult case, usually doesn't make a decision towards the very end, like May or June. But we don't know that. That's just something that's kind of common sense and that people know. It's conventional wisdom. But we could get a decision as early as February. So I just wanted to let you know that. And the other thing I want to let you know is that there are no cameras in the Supreme Court, so we won't be able to watch the hearing, and we won't be able to hear it either. And Friday is the soonest there will be an audio of the hearing, and maybe we'll figure out how to get you a link to the audio when it comes out on Friday. So next possible outcome. Can you move to the next slide? So the second possible outcome is the court says, yes, we can review what the administration did, and we decide that it was lawful for them to end the program. And that's that. There's no reason they couldn't do it, and they did it, and we're gonna uphold their decision to end it. If that happens, oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide. The second possible outcome is that the court decides that the way the administration ended the program was illegal or unlawful. If that happens, if the court says no to the government, the way you did this, the fact that you gave 3 different reasons for ending it and none of them hold up, shows us that you did not end this program the way you should have. If that happens, if the court says that, then DACA remains in place. And the court may say, since it was illegal to end it, we're going to go back in time to where not only were renewals allowed, but where first-time applications were, permitted. Because, in other words, they would say that the entire termination of DACA should not have taken place. So that's a possibility that they would go back in time to before the September date when the administration ended DACA. But even if the court does not reopen first-time applications, if it reaches this decision, it may be that our lawyers go back to the courts that have already ruled on this, and they might say, we want to reopen it to initial first-time applications. So we know that it will, that's the sort of unknown here. If the court were to decide that the ending of DACA was unlawful, we don't know what will happen to the first-time application issue. Next slide. Okay, this is where the one I had thought I was looking at earlier. The court could decide that the administration, that it does have the right to hear the case, but it makes the decision that the administration ended DACA properly. What happens if they reach that decision? Then DACA would end. And it's up to the administration to decide whether they end it immediately the minute the court makes its decision, or whether they allow people to keep their work authorization until it expires. And they probably have to decide what to do with the pending renewal applications that are in the hopper. So that would be if they decide that it ended lawfully. Next slide. The other possible outcome is that the court decides that DACA itself was an illegal program because only Congress has the power to start an immigration program of this kind. In other words, it doesn't just address the issue of how DACA ended, it actually decides whether DACA is legal, and it decides that it's not legal. What happens if they make a decision that DACA was not legal? That would end DACA, and it would still be up to the administration to decide whether to allow people to keep their work permits till they expire. But since the court will have decided that DACA is illegal, probably no renewals will be processed that are pending. So those are the 4 possible outcomes that everybody that's been looking at this has, and looked at a lot. We think these are the only 4 possible ways that the court could come out on the case. So now I know that's a lot of information all packed. But I want to briefly touch on what if the court decision is negative, either on any one of those grounds that I explained where DACA ends. The very first thing, and we get this question a lot at the UC Immigrant Legal Services Center, is what should I do? It is really important that whatever happens but with the court, that you continue your education. Education is a thing you have that nobody can take it away from you. And it's important to finish the education because we don't know what the future will hold in terms of new policies. There's an election coming up. There could be changes in the Senate. There could be a different president. So we should not be making any rash decisions because there's still a lot that could happen in the next few years. So 1, continue your education. The other thing is that, and maybe the folks from The Dream will speak more to this, but The Dream will still support you regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court decision. The other thing is, if you have time and desire and ability, you might want to get involved if there's a new push for a DREAM Act. It's very possible that if the court ends DACA, that there will be a lot of push for a DREAM Act. It's happened before. It's had bipartisan support before. So that's the other thing, is to shift gears and perhaps get involved in pushing for the DREAM Act, which would be broader than DACA. And the last thing I think that would be very important to do if there's a negative decision by the Supreme Court is to start looking at and educating yourself about the laws and opportunity that exist for you to gain an income through independent contracting or through starting your own business. In other words, if you do not have work authorization because DACA ends, there are still other sort of opportunities to start your own business, either as a contractor or as a for-profit business. And those you can do that without work authorization. So, next slide. All right, so a lot in a few minutes, and I will take questions now.
Okay, just unmuting myself. So scholars, there's a Q&A chat and also a chat box where you can type in your questions. I'll be happy to read those aloud for you. But before, as you're typing in those questions, I just want to reiterate what Maria said about the DreamUS standing behind you. Regardless of what happens with DACA, we will continue to support you in your education, with your scholarship, and also with any advocacy that we can do from our end to help Congress or to push Congress to find a solution for you. So stay focused on your studies. You will be able to get your degree with our support. And that's very, very important because, as Maria said, you will be able to take your education anywhere and do anything that you want to do in your career with it. So let's see, here's some questions coming up.
Do you want me to answer those in the box, or do you want me to actually answer them so that everybody?
Yeah, we'll do it. We'll do it verbally so everybody can hear them. So that would be good. So is there?
Oh, go ahead. So the first question here is, what about TPS? Is it under the same category as DACA? No, TPS is a very specific practice. It stands for Temporary Protective Status. it's usually applied to persons from a country that has undergone either a natural disaster or something that makes it very difficult for people to return back to that country because of either weather or some other kind of disaster situation. And it allows people to get that status and work. But it is not the same as DACA, and it is not being considered by the Supreme Court. The administration did end TPS for some countries, and the courts have actually stopped the end of TPS for those countries, but we don't know if that will continue to be the case or whether the administration will eventually do away with all the TPS countries. The second question is, what do you personally think the outcome will be? I have been in the civil rights field a long time and have been surprised so many times by decisions that I don't think I can predict what the outcome will be. You think you can, and then all of a sudden, the court takes a turn for whatever reason, or it reacts to public pressure, although they don't say they don't react to public pressure, and you get a surprising decision. The next question is, can DACA individuals join the military and have a path to citizenship? I think I'm going to leave this for Maureen to answer, who's our next speaker. Next question is, if they decide to end DACA, would they put us in removal proceedings or have us go to an immigration judge? This depends on everybody's situation is different. Some people have DACA and do have removal orders from the past. Some people have never had a removal order. And so those are two different situations. If somebody already has a removal order and applied for DACA and got DACA, it is possible that they could try and recalendar or revisit the removal order. But whether they did that or not, it would be if they did that, if they tried to go back to the removal order, they would have to do it through an immigration judge. Whatever happens will not happen without having to go in front of a judge in immigration court. Unless you have some kind of situation that would make you immediately deportable. But what I would say about that is, if that were the case, you probably would not have been approved for DACA. If they take DACA away, let's say you had DACA since before you turned 18, technically you have not been in the US illegally. Will this be changed if they take it off? I guess after they take it off, what question in regard to being barred if you try and fix people? Okay, this question refers to the fact that if you've been here with unlawfully, without authorization for 6 months, you have a 1-year bar before you can come back into the country. A lot of people, and that the clock doesn't start to run on that until you turn 18. So people who have had DACA since before they were 18, the time hasn't been running on their unauthorized status in, unlawful presence in the US. The question about if you can that you'll be barred if you try and fix papers through marriage. This is, again, depends on everybody's individual situation. I don't want to go into it too much. You won't be barred from trying to fix via marriage. It's that you would either have to leave the country to do that, or you might be able to do it from within the country. But that's all it's two different situations. When is it recommended to renew our work permits. I'm going to get to that in the next part of my presentation. And the last one is, hello everyone, when locating an immigration lawyer, how can I find a lawyer that will fight for me and not just want money? And we're going to get to that at the end of this presentation. What documents would you need to start a business? I can't answer that right now, but I can tell you that if you go to the website, Immigrants Rising, they have a wonderful entire section on this issue about how to start a business. That is really excellent and can take you through some really initial questions. What time will
yeah. Just Maria, I'm just going to say something that we will be sharing over the next few weeks, some information with scholars about starting a business and independent contracting. So please read our emails. We will be sending you information. Be on the lookout.
Okay, great. What time will the hearing be? I believe it's a 10 o'clock hearing, and it was originally scheduled for 60 minutes, but they've added another half hour, so it'll be a 90-minute hearing, and it'll be in the morning. And I will get to the DACA renewal in the next section. So those are the questions for now.
Maria, so there are actually a couple more questions that I have come in for you. Yes, I'll read them for you.
Okay.
A question regarding studying abroad. Is that possible for students to study abroad? For DACA students?
Right. No, it's not. When they ended DACA, even though they allowed some time for people to do, anyway, they let people's permits expire. What they did when they ended DACA was also end the possibility of what's called advanced parole for people with DACA. Advanced parole is what allowed people to be able to travel when they had DACA. And that ended when they ended this in September 2017. They ended the advanced parole possibility. So even the people that have DACA now, current, cannot travel.
And related to this, can they travel to places like Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, or other US territories?
So this is worth a whole other presentation. So if your DACA is current and you have, a valid EAD, you can travel to all those places. If you don't have DACA and you'd go to Puerto Rico, it's considered a commonwealth and not a state. And we do know about people that have had problems when they come back from Puerto Rico and they don't have DACA. Alaska is part of the United States and so is Hawaii. So for those two locations, the only thing to keep in mind is just the risks that are always associated with traveling when you have to go through the airport, which is a federal facility, and the folks that do the inspections there are federal employees. And that's sort of, people do it depending on their comfort level with the risk. You can travel with your passport. All kinds of people travel with a passport. But it is possible that if you have a passport and don't have a driver's license and all they see is your passport, they can ask you about your immigration status when you present a passport. And once they see your passport and they see that you're not a US citizen, they can ask you a follow-up question about your immigration status. There are airports that are better and airports that are worse for this, but we can, and maybe, Tanya, we can talk about maybe sending out more information about this. There's a lot of stuff written about this.
Okay, that would be great, Maria. Okay, let's have one more question. There's some anxiety around what happens when DACA ends. Is it possible that ICE will come looking for us? Will they be roundups? Could they come into our college campuses to try to get us?
Looking at it, yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, So, will ICE, take the opportunity to go after persons with that had DACA? This is what I think about this, but again, everything under this administration is so difficult to predict. But I would say that if you have DACA and you have a completely clean record, quote unquote clean, and by that I mean you didn't have a prior deportation order, or you don't have a prior serious criminal history, that they will not just go out and try and round up folks with DACA. We're talking about close to 700,000 people, and they don't have the resources to do that. So I think that the really important thing will be if folks lose DACA, it'll be really important to be very careful not to do anything that brings you to the attention of ICE. And by that I mean, anything that puts you into any kind of a legal proceeding, criminal legal proceeding. And the other thing I want to just mention is we get a lot of questions from our students throughout the UC system because we're in a state where cannabis is legal, even recreational. And I really want to reiterate to people that it's still on, federally, it's still an illegal drug. And so I think people have to be very, very careful about that, because if you're in a state where you feel like it's safe, it's not safe from the federal perspective.
Okay, let's go on, Maria.
Yeah, okay.
To, the DACA renewals, because I know there are a lot of questions coming in regarding that, so we might as well start talking about renewing your DACA.
Okay, all right. So I said earlier that the decision could come as early as January of the next year or as late as June. Until there's a decision, because of the way the courts have blocked the administration, until there's a decision, the DACA renewals are still being accepted. The advice that people are giving is that you should renew your DACA now when they're still being accepted. The only thing I would say about that is if you just renewed, like if you have, instead of like, if you have almost 2 years left, you got it renewed a month ago or 2 months ago, it may not make sense to renew it because the cost is so high and you still have close to 2 years left on it. So I would, in that situation, if it's a very recent renewal that you just received, I don't think it makes sense to go ahead and try again. I would say that anything short of, like if you have 6 to 8 months left on your DACA, you might want to renew. You should know that right now, the way the renewals are working, we can't quite see the pattern, but we think we see a pattern where if you have a lot left on your DACA versus a person that has like 3 or 4 months, it looks like they're renewing the ones with less time left first before they reach the ones that have, say, a year and 4 months still left. But, so that's the best I can tell you there. But yes, generally renew your DACA unless you just got it renewed. The other thing is don't let your DACA expire. I know that there's a sense of, well, it's so expensive And if it's going to end anyway, why should I bother? I really, really encourage you to not let your DACA expire. We don't know what's going to happen with the court. And in the meantime, if let's say the court doesn't decide till June, in the meantime, you could get your DACA renewed, and it could last you, a while. So it's really important that you don't let it expire. And the last thing is, and I think that we're going to put up a slide later on this, is check with your university, your college, or nonprofits in your area to find out if they are providing money for the renewal fee. I know this from talking to a lot of people that we serve, that some people have not renewed because of the cost. And I think it's unfortunate, but let's be creative about trying to find places that cover the renewal fee. So that's on DACA renewals.
And in your chat box, Sadhana, who's in the back end joined us, is putting some links to some organizations that might be offering assistance with the fees. So check those out, go to the chat box, pull those down. And we're not sure if all of them are still offering the assistance, but we know that they have offered them in the past, and some of them are probably still offering them right now. So please check those out. Let's see. And let me see if there are any questions.
Is the questions, right, on the DACA renewal?
Yes.
All right, let me open up my question.
Someone's asking, is it true that the DACA renewal fee price is going up?
I have read that they are proposing to raise both the cost of asylum applications and the DACA renewal. It hasn't happened yet, and I think there's going to be a lot of pushback on this, and I don't know if it'll happen before the Supreme Court reaches its decision. But it is a formal proposal from the administration to raise, and I think maybe some of you have seen it. I think it's something in the $700 range, but it hasn't happened yet, but they are proposing it.
Yeah. And if someone's DACA has expired, can they still renew it?
Yes, definitely. We do them all the time. If your DACA's expired, they will still process it, and no problem.
So they just fill out the forms regularly?
They have to, they go to a lawyer for sure, because it's just a little bit different than the traditional renewal, only in the sense that they have you, I think it's almost like you include the form that was like for an initial application, but it's totally doable, and it's happening all the time, and they do renew expired DACAs.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Okay, let's move on, because we have a lot more to go to, and there's going to be another section where we can do more question and answers. But thank you, Maria, and I'm going to turn it over now to Maureen, who's going to tell you about some possible solutions that you should be aware of to see if that if you're in that case. So go ahead, Maureen.
Okay, great. I'm going to start saying that this is meant to be a general overview. This could certainly be a much longer webinar and has on its own. So I'm probably not going to address your questions, but we'll have a question and answer at the end, and I will be available after this on my work email for questions, provided it's the sort of thing I do, since I am at a nonprofit and we don't do a lot of things like employment law. The biggest thing to remember is if you've never had a consultation with an immigration attorney, you should go and do one of those now. There's been an amazing grassroots program to get people all over the country, to get people enrolled in DACA, and that's amazing. But one of the things a program like that won't necessarily do is screen you for every sort of permanent legal status that you might be eligible for. So if you don't have an attorney or you haven't seen one, go do that now. There are a couple of basic facts that your attorney is going to want to know when you go for that consultation. So get that information ahead of time, especially since some of it, depending on how old you were when you came here, you may not remember. They're going to want to know how you entered the country. So was it on a visa? Did you cross the river outside of an entry point? They're going to want to know how many times you entered the country, especially if it wasn't with a visa. They're going to want to know how old you were when you got DACA and if you've had it continuously since then. They're going to want to know if you've ever been in immigration court and if you have an old removal order. They're going to want to know if you have family members who are US citizens or have green cards. And they're especially going to want to know, and I'm going to talk about why in a little bit, if any of those citizen or permanent resident family members filed immigration paperwork, filed a application for a green card that had your name on it as part of the application before May of 2001. And they're going to want to know, I apologize for the dog in the background, they're going to want to know about your criminal record, and that includes arrests. In immigration, they're allowed to look at criminal accusations, not just convictions. So arrest records are something you're going to need to include to give your attorney a full idea of what your situation is. Next slide. If you have gone to see an attorney, did you understand what was said? If you either didn't understand or there weren't any options, it may be worth getting a second opinion. You probably don't want to get a 10th, 11th, 12th. I mean, I definitely see people who just go from attorney to attorney hoping for that magic answer. And unfortunately, people that do that put themselves at real risk of being victims of fraud, somebody who's just going to promise them the moon. But if you don't feel like you had a good rapport with that first attorney, it may be worth seeing a second, especially if you went to somebody specialized. Like, I'll be honest, I work at a nonprofit. If you see me, I'm going to tell you whether or not I think you have a family-based application or whether or not you have a humanitarian-based application. I'm probably going to tell you, if you think you might have some employment-based option, go see someone else, because that's not what I do. So if there's an area of immigration that your first attorney doesn't specialize in, that might be another reason to go see someone else. And then also, has anything major in your life changed since the last time you talked to an attorney? If the answers to any of those questions from the previous slide is now different, you might want to go see someone and see if that makes a difference in your situation. If you've been a victim of a crime here, that might make a difference, although the U visas are like 15 years backed up, but it's still something to have in the pipeline. And then third, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, are there any new facts or circumstances either about your life or about what's going on in your country of citizenship that make it more unsafe for you if you were to be deported than it was before? That might be a reason to go see an attorney and see if your legal options have changed. Next slide. So we're going to talk about a couple of unusual options for DACA. These don't come up as often in webinars or in talks because they're unusual, but I don't want them to get missed, so I'd like to talk about them briefly. One is 245I. This one's a little bit unusual just because you guys are a little bit young for it, but some of the older DACA members, this might still be an option. It was an old quasi-amnesty that went away in 2001, where you paid your filing fee and you paid $1,000 on top of that, and either an employer or a family member would be able to sponsor you even though you were in the country without permission. So the important thing to remember about this is when 245I went away, it didn't go away for the people who were still in the pipeline. So if you had an application in front of the government before May of 2001, you can still use these old rules. And the other important thing to remember is when you look at whether or not a person gets to use the 245I rules or whether they have to use the present rules, it doesn't go by the application, it goes by the person listed. And so what that means is, let's say your aunt filed for your mom and you were included as your mom's derivative. If you are grandfathered into 245I, you can carry that with you even if you later use it in, say, a petition filed by your spouse. So for those of you who are old enough to be in this program, it's incredibly important that you realize that you are eligible to take advantage of this. It's also important that you start saving that extra $1,000. Next slide. So we had a couple of employment. I'm not going to talk about employment except for just this. H-1Bs are a temporary visa. And for the most part, they're a really bad option just because the number of visas available is minuscule compared to the number of people that apply every single year. But there's a small subcategory of H-1Bs that don't have a numerical limit. And that's for people in very specific educational or certain research positions tied to an educational, an institute of higher learning. So you need a college degree, you need a job that requires that degree, not just a degree, but that field, and you need one of these special Cap-exempt employers. And if you have one of those, then you at least might be eligible for an employment visa, although you would have to leave the US and come back. So this is definitely something you're going to want to think about long and hard and talk with a very good attorney about before you try it. But it is an option, and then that would potentially put you on the path to more permanent sponsorship, either by an employer or because you would now have a legal entry and have more options for family sponsorship. Next slide. Okay, and the third one is asylum, when this might still be an option for you, even though you've been here for a very long time. And again, if you are sitting here and none of this seems to apply to you, I specifically picked things that were extremely unusual because the more usual stuff, I figured you guys would at least have a passing familiarity with. And so I wanted to make sure these things got hit. So if you don't hear anything that applies to you, you may well have more commonplace options. So don't panic about this. For the most part, people who have been in the US for a very long time aren't going to be eligible for asylum, both because they're not gonna have up-to-date information about what's going on in their home country or their country of citizenship, I should say, the way a more recent immigrant would, but also because in general, asylum has a deadline. You have to apply within your first year of entry. But there's an exception for either changed circumstances or extenuating circumstances. And in some cases, these two exceptions are going to apply to DACA recipients. Now, that could be a matter of changed circumstances in your home country. So it used to be safe and now it's not, and that's a recent thing. It could be that there's something new about you and your life. So for example, I've changed my religion and people of my new religion are persecuted in my home country. I should get to apply for asylum even though I've been here for more than a year because I have this new change in my life that puts me at greater risk. Or for example, when I came as a kid, we didn't file for asylum based on persecution for gender identity or being an LGBTQI individual, because I didn't tell my parents I was only a little kid. I didn't quite understand what all that means. But now as an adult, I understand my identity better. And I understand that there's an aspect of my life that would put me at risk at my home country. That would be a very good reason to look into applying for asylum, even though you've been here much longer than 1 year. Next slide. And then for absolutely everybody who is a DACA recipient, unless you have an old order of removal that you cannot get reopened, but for everyone who's going in front of a judge, which is God forbid, you know, God willing is none of you, but this is the last line of defense, cancellation of removal. You need 10 years of 10 years of presence in the US, which every DACA recipient's going to have, which is why I said this is potentially available to all of you. You are going to need a US citizen or LPR spouse, parent, or child. So that's going to limit it. Some people aren't going to be eligible because of that, but they may be by the time DACA ends or by the time they're put into proceedings. You need to have good moral character. So again, most DACA recipients are not going to have a problem with this, but they need to be able to show that their removal from this country is going to cause hardship, unfortunately not to them, but to the US citizen or green card holding family member that is either left behind or accompanying them. So, you know, any sort of roadblocks in your life that are affecting the people around you with status, a child with a learning disability, a spouse who's financially dependent on you. That's the sort of thing you should also be bringing to your consult with the attorney. You're probably not going to want to put yourself in front of a judge, actively put yourself into removal proceedings, unless you have really a fantastically strong case, you know, a very, very ill child or something really incredibly difficult. But just have this in mind if in case DACA goes away and if in case you are put into proceedings, this is an option for you. And if you can in fact convince the judge that ordering you removed is really going to create more than average hardship for your family, the judge can give you a green card. Next slide. So where to look for help? I know there was a question about how do I know I'm getting an attorney who wants me and not just my money? Your nonprofit lawyers are definitely not going to want your money. A lot of those are free or they charge very nominal fees. Your private attorneys are going to want money, obviously, to keep the lights on and keep paying the rent. But two good ways to make sure that you find somebody who's reputable are, one, go and see if they're an AILA member. That's not foolproof. Not everybody is an AILA member, and not everybody who's an AILA member is great. But the fact that they're shelling out money for a professional membership in a specific practice area is usually a good indication. And I would also say, even if you think you earn too much to qualify for help from a nonprofit, talk to your local nonprofits because they're going to know which private attorneys they would recommend and which ones they would want to steer you away from. Next slide.
Before I move on to the next slide, just scholars, I wanted to let you know that we are putting in the chat box the links to these 3 links that you see on the slide. So the list of private immigration attorneys and also of nonprofits that can provide you with some immigration help. So go to the chat box and pull these down. Okay. And now we are ready for questions.
Okay.
So Maureen, I can read some of these to you.
Okay, great.
Do you have an answer? Can DACA individuals join the military and have a path to citizenship?
I know that was an option, at least theoretically, that was talked about when DACA first started. I don't practice in a part of the country with a strong military presence, so I don't have any military clients. From what I am understanding about the way in which this administration is interfering with pre-existing programs for immigrants in the military, I think it's unlikely, but I think your best guess is to go to one of those sites where you can search either AILA or the nonprofit link and look for attorneys in areas in and around military bases, because they're going to deal much more with military clients and they're going to be much more up on those issues.
Right. For the HB1 visas, when you talked about there being specific jobs or industries that where you might have an option, do you know what some of those industries might be, or a place where the
Education.
person could?
It's education. It's either directly in education or if you are doing research that's affiliated with. So if you're not employed by the university or the school, but you're with, say, a nonprofit that is connected with a institute of higher learning, those are covered. Those are the only two I am aware of. It has been a very, very long time since I've done employment, but I don't think anything's changed in the law. So I think those are still the only options.
So you're doing research with an institution or research with a nonprofit that's affiliated with an institution?
If it's affiliated with an institution of higher learning. So, and there's very technical rules about what is considered a qualifying institution. So that was meant to be just a hint of when you might want to go to an attorney that specializes in employment law, not something we would do a deep dive in here.
Got it. There's some questions regarding if DACA comes back, given the Supreme Court, will students be able to travel again or do study abroad?
It depends on how broadly the Supreme Court writes its decision. One really good cheat, most lawyers I think do this when they want to get a quick idea of what a decision is. When the decision is published, go to the actual decision and go all the way to the end of the last page, and the last 2 or 3 sentences will be the sort of what this means in reality. You can skip the 20 pages of reasoning and jump right to the Cliff Notes version of the decision. That's going to tell you what the impact is.
And have you heard of any cases in which an employer helps a DACA employee fix their immigration status? Does that actually happen?
It would be easier for people who were younger when DACA started and who don't have the at least 6 months of accrued unlawful presence, who don't have to worry about bars to coming back. But for somebody who would be able to leave and come back through an immigrant visa, I think it's a viable option, again, with an attorney. I don't know of anyone personally in the sense of I can say that, oh, my client, Maria Sanchez, did this because, again, at a nonprofit, I don't do employment law. But yes, for people who are young enough and who have had DACA continuously, I think that that's worth exploring.
So Donna, do you see any other questions that you want to pull in?
Let's see. I see that someone says, I have a 245I application since 2001, and it's been almost 19 years. I'm guessing she hasn't had a result on that.
So actually, I'm guessing that she's probably Mexican and is waiting for the priority dates, or Filipino. A couple of countries are incredibly, incredibly backlogged. The thing to remember is, again, if you are a named person on that application, anything filed by or for you can be processed under the 245I rules. So if you are subject to the 245I rules, that follows you. What you're going to need is a copy of that application to prove that you are covered. And then anything that you are qualified through. This is another one where I would say, please go and talk and have an individualized consult. The reason why 245I was rare enough that I included it is most people have gotten processed by now. It's been several years since I've dealt with a 245I application, so I don't want to get into details in case I misremember something. But if you were named on that application, you can carry that. You can carry those old rules over to a new application if you are eligible.
So I see several questions that are very specific to your case. And what I'm going to say to you is at the end of the webinar, we're going to give you Maureen's and Maria's email addresses. You can email them with your question that is very specific, or also go consult with a lawyer, which is probably the first thing you might want to do, because then you get someone that is going to spend longer amount of time with you. But I won't take those questions that are very specific to your case, because we will have Maureen's and Maria's emails with you. One general question before we move on is, people seeing ICE around or fearful that DACA is going to end. What can people do to prepare to be safe?
I think have an attorney's name on speed dial, even if you don't have, somebody that you know that you trust. Even if you don't hire them, there's not options for you, some that you would hire that your family feels comfortable with. Have somebody else know where your identity documents are. And I want to repeat what Maria said, because this is key. Try not to come to the attention of law enforcement as someone they want to arrest. Depending on where you are in the country, you will have different risks with, different degrees of interaction with law enforcement. In my experience, one of the things that is most likely to get you transferred from state or local law enforcement to immigration is a DWI. Don't drive drunk. More than anything else that, I'm assuming that you all are not assassins for hire or doing, intentional crimes of violence, but driving while intoxicated is definitely something ICE will pick you up for. And it's something that immigration judges take incredibly seriously. So that's one to really, really avoid. And if I could, there is one question in the question and answer that I would like to answer, because I think it's a couple of, so there was a question about if I was a victim of a crime several years ago and it was investigated, but not necessarily by the police, am I still eligible for a U visa? That's going to depend on where you are in the country and your individual local agency's policies. Some of them have time limits on how old a crime will be, and those time limits vary. Some of them don't. Also, it's not just the police, it's anyone who plays any role in a government capacity in investigating or prosecuting. Investigating counts as well. So it's the police, it's the DA. In a lot of states, it can be the judge. It can be the judge in, say, a custody proceeding where child abuse is alleged. It can absolutely be Department of Children and Families, or whatever acronym that agency goes by in your state. It can be the Department of Labor. It doesn't have to be the cops. So that's something you should check with a local attorney about, because they are going to know what the policies are in the county where you were a victim.
Great, thank you, Maria and Maureen. Scholars, before I end, I want to remind you that to please take care of yourself. Right now, it could be a stressful time. It might be a lot of anxiety, but sleep well, eat well, focus on what you can control. And there are things you have control over, like your studies or the activities that you're involved in, or maintaining your mental health by either meditating or exercising or finding ways to relax. And remember that we do have a wellness advocate, Elizabeth Hernandez, that is available for you to call, to share your thoughts, to get some tips and advice on how to deal with any anxiety or stress that you might be feeling. Her number is right on the screen for you and the times when she is available. You can also text her and she will get back to you the next hour that she's available for you. So use the resources that you have on your campus for any mental health, and also our own wellness advocate. And again, we believe in you. We are so much behind you. And no matter what happens, like we all say, you are here to stay. We will help as much as possible, and we will keep the scholarship available to you. And with that, I want to again thank Maria and Maureen. Here are their email addresses. Go ahead and write them down. If you want to reach out to them, they're happy to answer any specific questions in the area of expertise that they have. So you can email them with your questions. And with that, unless any last words from you, Maureen or Maria, before we close off?
No, I just want to say that, one, feel free to email me. We have a staff of about 10 lawyers, and we probably can't take your case because we only serve students that are University of California students. But if it's a sort of a broader question that's not about your case, but a legal question that's more general, we will definitely get back to you.
Same thing. I'm limited to detained residents of Connecticut, which thank God none of you are, and hopefully none of you ever will be, but happy to answer general questions.
Okay, with that, thank you, scholars, for joining us today. Again, we open our emails, our texts, keep involved in our Facebook group. We will be pushing information to you as soon as we get it and as much as we can to help you out. Thank you for joining us today, and have a good day, everybody. Good night.
Good night.